Vladimir Putin stepped onto British soil for one of the most tightly controlled visits in recent history. Security was doubled. Optics were critical. Every move had been rehearsed, except this one. As Putin approached the ceremonial line at Horse Guards Parade, he pointed to a royal guard in his path and gave a quiet order. "Move this one, I don't walk around." But the guard didn't move. Not when a Kremlin aide shouted. Not when a Russian bodyguard crossed the barrier. Not even when Putin himself issued the command out loud. And when the guard finally broke his silence, it wasn't just a refusal, it was a statement that echoed across two nations. So before we show you exactly what happened that day, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because this wasn't a diplomatic standoff. This was a lesson in what real power looks like when it doesn't move at all. Horse Guards Parade wasn't used to this kind of silence. Sure, you get your ceremonial quiet during formal occasions, when every boot step, every rifle movement, every flutter of a flag follows choreography older than most of the countries whose diplomats fill the viewing stands. But this wasn't that kind of silence. This was the kind that makes your shoulders tense up without you realizing it. The London sky was one of those perfect summer blues that makes tourists think they've struck gold. Not a cloud anywhere, warm stones underfoot, and that crisp military smell of brass polish and pressed wool hanging in the air. The kind of day where everything should go smoothly, where protocol runs like clockwork, and everyone goes home with exactly the photos they came for. But today felt different from the moment the first security sweeps began at dawn. Behind the rope barriers, maybe 200 people had gathered. A mix of tourists clutching guidebooks, veterans wearing their old regimental ties, and journalists with that particular alertness that comes when they know they're covering something that could go sideways. You could feel it in how they held their phones, ready but hesitant, like they weren't quite sure what they were about to witness. A middle-aged schoolteacher from Manchester kept checking her watch, wondering if she should have brought her class to see this particular ceremony. 2 rows back, a retired sergeant major from the parachute regiment stood with his grandson, quietly explaining the significance of each uniform while scanning the security arrangements with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading dangerous situations. Near the front, a Japanese tourist couple whispered to each other in concerned tones, their carefully planned London itinerary suddenly feeling far more serious than expected. The rows of guards stood in perfect formation beneath their towering bearskin hats. Grenadier guards, Coldstream guards, each man a study in absolute stillness. Red tunics pressed so sharp you could probably cut paper on the creases, brass buttons catching the sunlight like tiny mirrors. Rifles held at precisely the same angle they'd been holding them for centuries. To the casual observer, they looked like the world's most expensive lawn ornaments. To those who knew better, they looked like what they were: combat veterans playing dress-up for the tourists while staying ready for anything. Because today's guest wasn't your typical diplomatic visitor. Vladimir Putin was coming to Horse Guards Parade, and everyone from the groundskeepers to the intelligence officers tucked away on nearby rooftops knew that when Putin travelled, things had a way of not going according to plan. British security had been running double shifts for a week. Snipers positioned on every rooftop with a clear line of sight, aerial surveillance making quiet passes every 4 minutes, and enough plainclothes officers scattered through the crowd to staff a small police station. Even the tourists seemed to sense something was off. They weren't leaning over the barriers with their usual irreverent energy, snapping selfies and asking guards to smile. Not today. Not with this particular head of state, rolling up in armoured vehicles with men who looked like they'd stepped out of a Cold War thriller. The motorcade announcement crackled over radio. Sovereign arrival in 60 seconds. And that's when the real tension began. The convoy rolled through the gates like something out of a spy movie. 4 black SUVs with windows so heavily tinted they looked like rolling shadows, flanked by Metropolitan Police outriders who'd clearly been briefed to expect trouble. What struck you wasn't just the obvious security, but the way the vehicles moved. Too smooth, too coordinated, like they were gliding rather than driving. The lead vehicle's antenna array was more complex than anything typically seen at diplomatic events. Somewhere in those cars, electronic countermeasures were quietly jamming every frequency within 100 meters, turning mobile phones into expensive paperweights and making the press corps nervously check their equipment. Even the pigeons seemed to sense something was off, abandoning their usual posts along the palace eaves in favor of more distant perches. Putin stepped out of the second vehicle with that unhurried pace that manages to look casual while somehow commanding every eye in the courtyard. Mid-70s, but moving like a man 20 years younger, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He didn't immediately greet the British delegation waiting for him. Instead, he stopped and let his gaze sweep across the entire parade ground, taking inventory, assessing, reading the room like a chess player studying the board. His entourage was exactly what you'd expect from a former KGB operative turned president. Men in dark suits with faces that suggested they'd seen things they'd never discuss at dinner parties. No visible weapons, but the kind of coiled alertness that makes you wonder what they're carrying under those perfectly pressed jackets. Putin's chief aide, a thin man with steel grey hair and the expression of someone permanently calculating risks, leaned in and murmured something in rapid Russian. Putin nodded once, then began moving toward the red carpet that had been laid across the ancient stones like a bridge between diplomacy and tradition. That's when he stopped. Directly in his path, maybe 12 feet ahead, stood a single royal guard, not blocking him exactly, just there, positioned perfectly along the ceremonial axis of the courtyard, in precisely the spot where protocol demanded a guard should stand during state visits. Every element of his posture said this was where he belonged, and that belonging wasn't negotiable. Putin's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the kind of focused attention of someone who'd spent decades reading situations and finding the pressure points. He turned to his aide and said something sharp and clipped in Russian. The aide gave a tight nod, then approached the nearest British official, a young Foreign Office liaison who'd probably been briefed extensively on how to handle difficult moments, but was clearly realizing that briefings and reality were two very different things. Then Putin spoke, his accented English cutting through the summer air like a blade. "Move this one, I don't walk around." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. There was something in his tone, not quite a command, not quite a request, that suggested he'd never had to repeat himself twice. The British aide blinked, probably running through every diplomatic protocol he'd ever memorized and finding nothing that covered this particular scenario. His gaze flicked toward the guard, then back to Putin, then toward the senior British officials who were suddenly very interested in their clipboards. "Sir, this position is part of the ceremonial formation." Putin raised his hand, just slightly, just enough to stop the explanation mid-sentence. "He moves, or I do not continue." The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable quiet of ceremony. It was the electric stillness that comes when everybody suddenly realizes they're watching something that could go very wrong very quickly. Tourists lowered their phones, not sure if they should be recording this or pretending it wasn't happening. A few children tugged on their parents' sleeves, sensing the tension, even if they didn't understand it. Behind the barriers, you could actually hear people holding their breath. And through it all, the royal guard stood exactly as he had been standing. He didn't flinch, didn't shift his weight, didn't even seem to register that the most powerful man in Eastern Europe had just demanded he move. His name was Thomas Redley, though the tourists pointing their cameras at him had no way of knowing that. To them, he was just another red-coated figure in an elaborate costume drama, probably some actor hired to stand very still and look impressive. They couldn't have been more wrong. 29 years old, born in the tiny Wiltshire village of Tefont Magna, population 207 if you counted the sheep, which most people did since there wasn't much else to count. His father ran the village post office. His mother was a retired district nurse, and nothing in his upbringing suggested he'd one day find himself staring down world leaders in the heart of London. He'd joined the army after a chance encounter outside Windsor Castle one foggy evening. Walking home from the pub, slightly drunk and monumentally lost, he'd spotted a lone guard standing post in the swirling mist. Something about that perfect stillness, that absolute composure in the face of wind and cold and the chaos of tourists had struck him like lightning. That, he'd thought, is what discipline should look like. He'd enlisted 3 months later. Redley wasn't the strongest recruit in his intake, wasn't the fastest, wasn't the loudest, wasn't the one shouting motivated battle cries during morning runs, but he was the one every instructor noticed for the same reason. He didn't react, screamed at during drill, stone-faced, standing in freezing rain for hours, motionless, deliberately provoked to see if he'd break, nothing. His nickname, whispered rather than shouted, was simple: the wall. Not because he shut people out, but because once he took a position, he simply didn't move, ever. His service record read like a masterclass in quiet professionalism. No disciplinary actions, no commendations for heroics. Just footnote after footnote of steady reliability that most people never saw, but the right officers always noticed. Held post during 14-hour protest siege without water break. Maintained crowd control during stadium evacuation drill, refused to abandon position despite technical malfunction in communications. Operational deployment, Estonia, maintained checkpoint security during power grid failure, 12-hour blackout. His company sergeant had once written in an evaluation, Redley possesses the rare quality of becoming more reliable under pressure rather than less. While other soldiers react to stress, he absorbs it and converts it into focus. In 20 years of service, I have never seen him make a decision based on personal comfort or convenience. That assessment was buried in classified files, but it explained why his name kept appearing on the most sensitive assignments. No medals hanging on his chest, no headlines written about his service. But those who knew, knew. His assignment to ceremonial duty at Horse Guards Parade wasn't a punishment or a reward. It was recognition of something rarer than heroics, absolute reliability. They sent Redley, when the job had to be done quietly, completely, and without any need for personal recognition. And today, standing 12 feet from Vladimir Putin, with the eyes of the world watching, he was doing exactly that job. The summer sun beat down on the brass buttons of his scarlet tunic, and you could see sweat gathering under the black wool collar of his uniform. The tall bearskin hat cast a shadow across his face, giving him the appearance of a statue that had forgotten it was supposed to be human. He'd seen Putin's signal toward him, heard the aide's panicked consultation with British officials, watched the security details on both sides tense up like coiled springs. But Thomas Redley didn't move. Not because he was being defiant, not because he was making a political statement, but because the role didn't permit it. You don't adjust your stance for weather, for insults, for crowds, or for the convenience of visiting dignitaries. You're not there to choose who passes or who doesn't. You're there to represent something larger than yourself, and that something doesn't yield to anyone's personal preferences, not even a president's. Behind the velvet rope, a small group of older men watched the scene unfold, with expressions that suggested they understood exactly what was happening. Veterans, you could tell from their posture, the way they held themselves with that particular military bearing that never completely fades. One leaned toward his companion and nodded subtly toward Redley. That one held position during the mortars in Tapa. You think he's going to move for a politician? The other gave a grunt that could have meant respect, disbelief, or both. And that's when the British aide made his move. Poor bastard. Looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. But duty was duty. He approached Redley with the careful step of someone walking through a minefield, his voice tight with protocol and barely contained panic. Guardsman, you've been requested to step aside for the presidential party to... Nothing. No response. No eye contact. No shift in posture. Just Thomas Redley, standing exactly as he'd been standing, as if the aide were talking to empty air. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then kept stretching until it became something else entirely. Something that felt less like stubbornness and more like principle made visible. The Russian delegation had stopped moving. Putin's security detail was studying the scene with the calculating expressions of men trying to decide whether this was a protocol hiccup or something more serious. Even the press corps had gone quiet, sensing that whatever was unfolding here was bigger than a simple ceremonial glitch. And through it all, Redley remained motionless. Not angry, not defiant, just absolutely immovably present. That presence, That refusal to yield even an inch was starting to speak louder than any words could have. The Russian security officer, who'd been watching from the sidelines, decided he'd seen enough diplomatic dancing. He was built like a tank and moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent years making problems disappear quietly. No visible insignia, just the coiled intensity of a man used to doors opening when he walked towards them. His scan of the situation was quick but thorough. The guard, the crowd, the British handlers trying to manage an escalating situation. Then he ducked under the velvet rope. The reaction was immediate. Sharp intakes of breath from the tourist line. Someone's phone lowered instinctively. A child pointed and asked her mother what was happening, only to be shushed with the kind of urgency that meant things were getting serious. The Russian's footsteps were deliberate, measured. Not threatening, exactly, but not deferential either. His jacket was cut well enough to hide whatever he might be carrying, and his confidence suggested he'd done this sort of thing before. Maybe in Moscow, maybe in occupied territories, maybe in places where uniformed soldiers weren't allowed to say no. He was going to touch the Royal Guard, just a nudge, just enough to move him aside like an inconvenient piece of furniture. His posture said this was routine, that he'd handled situations like this 100 times before. He reached for Redley's shoulder, and that's when he was intercepted. The intervention was so smooth, it took the crowd a moment to realize what had happened. 1 second, the Russian was reaching for the guard. The next, there was someone else standing between them. A British naval officer, in crisp navy blue, his shoulders squared and chin lifted, with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to announce itself. When he spoke, his Russian was fluent, precise, and absolutely unmistakable. Jeśli wy dotronietесь do soldata korony, это будет расценено как враждебный акт. If you lay a hand on a soldier of the crown, it will be considered a hostile act. The Russian froze mid-reach, his hand still extended, weight forward on his toes. Words hung in the summer air like a challenge carved in ice. He lowered his arms slowly, not because he was intimidated, but because he understood exactly what line was being drawn and what crossing it would mean. Lieutenant Commander Patrick Ainsley had never expected his fluent Russian to matter this much on British soil. He'd served as a naval attaché in Belarus during the intelligence operations of 2016, navigating meetings where every conversation might be recorded and every smile could signal a threat. But nothing had felt quite as precarious as this moment. A courtyard full of armed soldiers, royal security, foreign dignitaries and tourists, all balanced on the edge of an international incident. The Kremlin aide's throat worked around a difficult swallow. He leaned toward Ainsley and murmured, "This is not how we intended for this to proceed." But Ainsley wasn't listening, because from behind the group came the voice that turned the entire courtyard to stone. Not loud, not shouted, but unmistakable. I gave an order. Putin had stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, his voice carrying that particular quality of someone who'd never had to repeat himself twice. Every camera in the press section swung toward him. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Everyone turned to look at the Royal Guard. Would he flinch now? Would he yield? Would the red-coated soldier finally acknowledge the reality of power and step aside? But Thomas Redley, he hadn't even blinked, still as stone. Eyes locked on that distant point guards are trained to focus on, rifle held at precisely the regulation angle, as if the most powerful man in Eastern Europe had said nothing at all. And that silence, complete, so unshakable, profound, and was starting to feel like the most powerful response possible. Putin's eyes narrowed, but not with rage, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had never been refused twice in a row. He stepped closer, closing the gap with deliberate authority. Not aggressive, but undeniable, like gravity asserting itself. When he spoke again, it was directly to Redley. "You wear the uniform of a soldier, but you ignore the command of a head of state." There it was. The public challenge, wrapped in diplomatic silk, but sharp enough to draw blood. A direct question that demanded an answer, posed in front of cameras that would carry whatever happened next to every corner of the world. But Redley still didn't turn his head. His lips didn't part. His breathing remained steady and controlled. He simply stood. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, you could hear the collective realization ripple through the crowd. This wasn't a man being stubborn. This was a man upholding something larger than himself. Ainsley stepped forward slightly, not to block Putin, but to address the Kremlin aide, his voice low enough not to echo, but sharp enough to be heard by everyone who mattered. The Royal Guard is not under foreign jurisdiction. Not by treaty, not by rank, not by protocol. The aide looked genuinely uncomfortable now. But surely there must be some accommodation. What you're asking, Ainsley cut him off gently but firmly, would breach ceremony, chain of command, and British sovereign protocol. It is not his place to move, it is yours to go around. Behind them, a subtle movement caught the crowd's attention. An older man in ceremonial dress, silver hair, chest decorated with enough medals to tell stories of decades of service, gave the slightest nod of approval. The moment had turned. You could feel it, like a change in atmospheric pressure. Putin paused, his lips pressing together into something that might have been a smile, if smiles could carry threat and calculation in equal measure. But he wasn't finished. He took one more step forward and spoke again, this time not to Ainsley or his aide, but directly to the guard who had refused to acknowledge him. You serve your crown with such loyalty. I wonder, does your crown serve you with the same devotion? It was a rhetorical knife designed to cut at the very foundation of service and duty. For a split second, it looked like it might find its mark. Then Thomas Redley spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, without any trace of strain or emotion. He didn't turn his head, didn't break that ceremonial forward gaze, but his words carried across the courtyard with perfect clarity. Standing ceremonial guard is not a negotiation. This post belongs to the crown, not the visitor. The silence that followed was different now, not tense with anticipation, but heavy with respect. Here was a man who understood exactly what he represented, and wasn't about to let anyone, regardless of their title or power, diminish it. Putin tilted his head slightly, studying Redley's profile like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Your crown has learned nothing from war, it seems. The insult was thinly veiled, but clearly intended, a direct challenge to everything the guard represented. But Redley's response came without hesitation, delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who'd thought about these things long and hard. We learned that silence wins more ground than noise. Somewhere in the crowd, a father lifted his young daughter so she could see over the heads in front of them. She pointed toward Redley and whispered, "Papa, is he allowed to say that to the president?" Her father's answer was quiet but clear. "Sometimes, sweetheart, they have to." The wind had picked up slightly, just enough to lift the edge of Redley's tunic and make the flag snap with a bit more authority. But he remained locked in position, feet planted, hands steady, breathing controlled. Something fundamental had shifted in the courtyard. The man who stood still had just spoken for more than himself. He'd spoken for an idea, a principle, a way of understanding what strength really meant. Putin studied him for another long moment, then did something no one expected. He smiled, not with warmth or admiration, but with the recognition of someone who'd spent his life testing boundaries and had just found one that wouldn't bend. Without another word, he pivoted sharply and began walking again, this time arcing around the guard's position, without fanfare, without acknowledgement, without any attempt to make it look like anything other than what it was. A concession. The British Foreign Secretary, watching from the gallery above, exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Relief mixed with something that might have been pride. As Putin rejoined the ceremonial path and the formal inspection continued, a palace radio crackled, "Resume normal sequence." The guards didn't flinch. The ceremony continued. But everyone present knew they'd just witnessed something that would be talked about long after the diplomatic communiques were filed and forgotten. As Putin disappeared into the formal receiving line, the tension in the courtyard began to dissipate. But something else took its place. A kind of quiet understanding that real power doesn't always announce itself with authority and demands. Sometimes it just stands still and refuses to be moved. Behind the rope barrier, something beautiful began to happen. An older man in a black beret, his left pants leg cut wider to accommodate a prosthetic, stepped forward. No cameras followed him. No microphones caught his movement. But those nearby noticed. He looked directly at Redley and slowly raised his hand to his brow in a perfect military salute. He held it until his arm trembled from the effort, then lowered it with dignity and stepped back into the crowd. Another veteran followed, then another. Some saluted. Others simply stood at attention. No cheers, no chants, no dramatic gestures, just quiet recognition of something they understood better than most. It wasn't political. It wasn't anti-anything. It was something older and deeper than nationalism. It was respect for principle. Redley couldn't acknowledge them. Duty forbade it. But those watching closely saw his eyes glisten for just a moment before hardening back into ceremonial focus. He had not moved, but around him, everything else had. The ceremony continued with military precision, every movement to be timed to the second, every command executed with centuries of tradition behind it. But something in the air had fundamentally changed. Then, from the edge of the Russian delegation, something remarkable happened. A man in distinctive naval dress blues stepped forward. Not part of Putin's inner circle, not one of the Kremlin's security detail. His uniform was different, cut in a style that marked him as representing another nation entirely. Ukraine. He stopped just outside the protocol boundary, still within sight of the cameras, but beneath their primary focus. The palisades didn't stop him, neither did the British officials. Perhaps they recognized what was about to happen and understood its significance. He faced Guardsman Redley, who had not moved a centimetre throughout the entire confrontation, and slowly raised his hand in salute. Not the sharp movement of drill ceremony, not the casual gesture of acknowledgement. This was a soldier's tribute, one that transcended nationality, rank, politics, or personal allegiance. Redley remained motionless, eyes forward, duty intact. But the air around him responded to what was happening. The quiet in the courtyard deepened, not with tension now, but with reverence. Everyone suddenly realized they were no longer watching a diplomatic standoff. They were witnessing something fundamental about human dignity. One soldier saluting another. Not for what he had done, but for what he had refused to do. From the press section, a BBC microphone caught a whispered comment from a veteran in the crowd. "That's not for England. That's for dignity itself." Putin didn't look back as he completed the formal inspection and walked toward his waiting motorcade. His composure remained perfect, his bearing unchanged, but something had shifted. He'd encountered something he couldn't command, couldn't intimidate, couldn't move through force of will or position. Lieutenant Commander Ainsley remained at his post, already mentally composing the classified report that would eventually be titled Ceremonial Breach, De-Escalation Through Principled Non-Compliance. Inside the Palace Intelligence Suite, photographs would be analysed for weeks. Freeze frames of body language, decision points, the exact moment when ceremony became something larger than itself. But none of that analysis would capture what the civilians behind the barrier felt in their bones. That real power doesn't always bark commands or demand immediate obedience. Sometimes it just stands still. And by doing so, it reminds the world that not everything can be ordered to move. Not everything bends to authority. Some things, the right things, remain exactly where they belong, no matter who tells them otherwise. As the crowd began to disperse and the normal rhythm of the day resumed, conversations buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with celebrity or spectacle. People weren't just discussing what they'd seen. They were processing what it meant. A young woman, still recording on her phone, spoke directly to her camera. "I'm not sure what we just witnessed, but I know it mattered. That guard risked everything to stand for something bigger than himself. That's not just duty, that's courage." An elderly veteran, explaining the scene to his grandson, put it more simply. That man didn't move because moving would have meant something, and some things are too important to compromise, even for presidents. The grandson, maybe 10 years old, watched as Redley maintained his perfect posture, even as the ceremony wound down around him. Was he scared, Grandpa? Probably, but he did it anyway. That's what courage is, doing the right thing when you're scared. Behind them, an American tourist was reviewing footage on his phone with his wife. "Look at this moment," he said, pointing to the screen. "Right when Putin walked around him instead of forcing the issue. That's when you know who really won." His wife nodded slowly. "He never raised his voice, never argued, just stood there. And somehow that was stronger than anything else could have been." As the afternoon wore on and the tourists eventually dispersed, Thomas Redley remained exactly where duty required him to be, silent, watchful, and absolutely unshakable. Because some things are worth standing for, no matter who tells you to move. Some things are worth the risk of international incidents and diplomatic protests. Some things are worth speaking truth to power, even when that truth is delivered through silence. And sometimes, if you stand still long enough, the whole world learns to respect the ground you're defending. So what do you think? Was Guardsman Redley right to hold his ground, even when faced with one of the world's most powerful leaders? Should ceremony and tradition yield to diplomatic convenience? Or does standing firm sometimes send the most important message of all? And here's the deeper question. In our age of compromise and accommodation, is there still power in simply refusing to be moved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And these conversations matter more than you might think. If this moment stayed with you, if it reminded you that real strength doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that not everything has to bend to pressure, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground. And don't stop here. Your next Royal Guard story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real authority doesn't demand space. It earns it by standing still when everyone else expects you to move.